criticality, cost, sensitivity of the assets. And then there are threat factors, things like the type of action taken, whether the threat agent is internal versus external. And the reason that's in there, and that's just an example, is because at least today, if an organization suffers some sort of security event and it was a trusted insider that perpetrated the event, the ramifications are different than if it was an external attacker. Right? So that difference is important in some circumstances. And then the competency issue gets to the point of, say, for example, someone who breaches security and takes away nuclear weapons information. Okay? Well, the breach occurred, but their ability to capitalize on that varies. They may have all the secrets in the world, but not have the materials, the skills, and resources to apply that in a way that generates nearly as much damage. So this notion of competency plays a role as well as one of the factors. And again, the factors I'm listing here are examples. There are more. Secondary loss factors are organizational considerations. Right? An example would be timing of the event. Is it year-end processing if you're a financial organization or something like that? Due diligence is a big one. Right? How effective have we been in situating ourselves to prevent this in the first place and then respond effectively? That due diligence is critical when we're dealing with reputation and legal loss magnitude issues. And then detection and response are critical. So an event occurs, how quickly did you detect it and respond to it so that you can contain it and minimize loss? So these are some of the organizational factors. And then environmental factors. And examples of those are laws and regulations, the media, and other stakeholders. Our competition and such play a role there. So this is kind of the fundamental breakdown, if you will, of this taxonomy at this layer of abstraction. It goes deeper. But when we're doing the analyses, and some people, when they see this taxonomy, they get a little wrapped up in, oh, that's complex. There's a ton of work there. Well, no, not really. First of all, once you get used to using it, it becomes second nature and is very quick to apply. Secondly, you can choose the level of abstraction you do your analysis in, and you might go deeper in the analysis in some circumstances when maybe there's more at stake and you want to be sure you haven't overlooked something, right? And other times you operate at a very high level of abstraction and you can do quick and dirty analyses and a good enough job for that circumstance, right? To apply your resources intelligently and stuff. So, don't let apparent complexity concern you, because you're in control of how complex you want to make it. Now, back to what I mentioned a little bit earlier. The probability of action is driven by value, level of effort, and risk from the threat agent's perspective. Okay. Now, what's interesting there is you see the bubble for risk there. Well, we've got a bubble there for risk, and we've got a bubble at the top for risk. What that means is we have the same taxonomy at that level, only from the aggressor's perspective. Okay? It's risk from their perspective. Loss event frequency, probability of getting caught. Loss magnitude, probable consequences with getting caught. What that allows us to do is some interesting analyses of the different aggressors we face and how we can affect that risk equation for them. Right? Likewise, as an aggressor, we can analyze our own circumstance relative to what we're trying to accomplish. So this has some interesting implications in, say, defense or those sorts of law enforcement or other environments where you're doing scenario analysis and trying to understand, say, your opponent's perspective. So I thought I'd share that. And by the way, if anybody has any questions throughout this, please don't hesitate to ask. Sometimes I get on a roll and people might be afraid of breaking my rhythm, and that's okay. So, with this, understanding of probability versus possibility, and then developing this taxonomy so I have a decent understanding of risk, there was this transition that the organization had to go through to be risk-focused versus purely a security focus. We had to validate the approach, right? I wasn't going to presume, having developed this taxonomy and such, that I had a clue. So I took the taxonomy and the measurement approach and the use of, planning to use Bayesian analysis as the computational probabilistic analysis for it. And I thought, I better get this validated by somebody because I could be on thin ice. So I took it to the actuaries, the vice presidents of the actuarial department for the company I worked for. And these people live and breathe risk and statistics and probability and such, and had them review it. And fortunately, they gave it 2 great big thumbs up and were very enthusiastic about it and such. So that was a good first vetting. Then I also had to take it in front of the auditors, both the internal auditors and external auditors, because they're the ones who are grading the organization at any given time on their risk management capabilities. And if they don't agree with it, if they don't see value in it, then you're really swimming upstream, and that's not something you want to do if you can avoid it. So I took it to them, and lo and behold, the internal folks liked it so much they had me train all their auditors in it. The external folks, which were one of the big 4 firms, they wanted to know more about it, and I only gave them enough to make them comfortable and wouldn't train them in it, unless they wanted to pay me. So at any rate, that level of vetting also took place. Then we had to train the people on my staff, and I was fortunate enough to have a lot of very sharp people in the organization, and so I went about training them in the nomenclature and the analysis approach and that sort of thing. And that was an interesting experience for me, because what I discovered was various mindsets respond differently to this approach. So for example, some folks who are particularly engineering focused, right? So they're very into numbers and precision, a lot of them, right? And that's a sweeping statement, but a lot of them are. And the concern I ran into occasionally with some folks like that was, well, if you can't measure it to 3 decimal points of precision, it's really not worth doing. Okay, well, that may be true in some circumstances, rocket science perhaps. But when you're talking about risk, precision is a pipe dream. Okay, there's no risk analysis that can defensively claim to be precise, because essentially risk is a projection of what could occur in the future, all right? And that's a dicey proposition, right? So, so we had to overcome, some folks who came to the table with that mindset, and then there were other folks too who were very experienced security professionals and had always taken a very specific approach to security, right? And they'd built their reputations on it, and this is what they were comfortable with. And by God, that's the only way it was done. And anything new just couldn't be truthful, couldn't be useful. So, worked with them too. Good news is, of all the people I worked with and trained, they all eventually came around to my way of thinking. Maybe it's the fact they worked for me? No, that couldn't be it. So at any rate, but I had to train them and make them competent in the analysis, and that was an ongoing process. And we'll talk more about how that turned out. Then I had to educate management. All right, and this was really important because management was used to us coming to the table with statements of high risk, don't do that. All right, and then oftentimes not being able to really do a good job of defending that conclusion or that statement, all right? We'd fall back on, well, it's high risk because the walls could come crumbling down around us, the bad guys could get us, these sorts of things. Statements around possibility rather than probability. And again, management's used to dealing with risk as a probability issue, and so if you're not speaking to them in those terms, they don't understand it. So, again, what they're used to is us coming to the table with these statements of, these Chicken Little statements, right? And oftentimes they would discount us then. They'd quit listening when we walked in the door. We had to tell them, no, we've changed our approach. This is how we're approaching it now. And so when we talk about something being high risk, there's numbers around that, and you probably want to pay attention. I'll talk more about that in one of the use case examples.